Of some people in World War II and their responses to what were ultimately the hound of heaven, if you will, recognizing that they needed to reconcile themselves to the situations they were in, but more importantly, reconcile their thinking and align it with God's. And so we kind of used two scriptures. First of all, Revelation 21, where Christ says, I'm making all things new. Which means there's coming a time when these types of things that we're talking about aren't going to be there anymore. There's going to be reconciliation. There will be no tears, because order to creation will be restored. And then there's Matthew 5. This was part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus was gobsmacking the crowd. They were hearing things that just simply made no sense. They were antithetical to what the normal thinking was. And he said this, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So this was something that would have been an accepted norm in that society. You don't like the people that don't like you. But I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Now there's one set of standards right there that challenges us every day. Love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Not easy to do. That you may be children of your Father in heaven, because he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. But if you love those who love you, what reward is that? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet your own people, only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? So what he's saying is, followers of Christ are on a different standard altogether than the world. The world sees things as an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And Jesus says none of that is true. In fact, it's anti the message that Christ brought. So, the last 2 weeks we've looked at some just examples that are just unbelievable of how this scripture's been placed into direct application. The first week was the guy named Mitsuo Fuchida. He was the guy who architected the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was the designer. He was the person that was in the air that radioed back to his fleet, Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Complete surprise has been achieved at Pearl Harbor. Well, when he came back after the war, he was waiting at a dock in Tokyo for some POWs to unload, and there he saw one of his best friends who he thought was dead. Kana Gasaki was the man's name. His friend had been at Midway. Bomb had hit the ship he was on, blew his arm off. He's an amputee now. Fuchida didn't get to fly at Midway. He was supposed to lead that raid as well, or that air attack, but he had appendicitis, so he is sidelined. May have saved his life, maybe. But the man had lost an arm, so when he lost the arm, he was sent over to America, where he was at a hospital in Salt Lake City. And this hospital was for the amputees of both the European Theater of Operation and the Pacific Theater of Operation. It had all these prisoners of war at this one place, amputees, who were being treated and cared for. Well, this brings up the second person in our little triangle, Peggy Covell. Peggy's parents had been missionaries. And she volunteered to leave upstate New York and went all the way over to Colorado, and then eventually to Salt Lake City, where she was in the Red Cross, and she was volunteering to do work with these people. She spoke excellent Japanese because her parents had been missionaries in Japan. And she attended to Kanagasaki, as well as all of the rest of the Japanese prisoners, with what could only be described as care and compassion. So, although she had spent most of her life in Japan, she was back in America because it was time to go to college. There was a missionary that we knew and supported in Kazakhstan. And when it came time for his daughter to go to school, he sent her back to America, where she went to the University of South Alabama. This is much the same kind of thing. The daughter became old enough to attend college. She comes back upstate New York. Now that she's back in America, she's just graduated. There's one little sidebar there. Peggy was going to Salt Lake City to, if you will, for lack of a better term, minister, tend to, pastor, if you will, pastoral care. The Japanese, but her parents had been beheaded by Japanese in the Philippine Islands because they had fled Japan right before the war because it was obviously not a good time to be a Westerner there. They retreated to the Philippines where they thought they would be safe. Japan invades the Philippines very shortly after Pearl Harbor. The defense of the Philippines is overwhelmed. MacArthur pulls out, takes his troops with him, vows he will return. There's a few guerrillas left and a few people like the Cavales. They retreat way back up into the jungle into a place called Hopevale, where they lived for almost 2 years. But eventually one of the guerrillas was brought them to the place where these people were all staying. They let the Filipinos go. They kept the Americans. They gave them 30 minutes to pray, beheaded all of the adults, bayoneted the children. So Peggy's mom, dad, and two brother and sister were all killed by the Japanese. Yet she's now going to Salt Lake City, where she is attending to the amputees. According to Kanagasaki, she was not only tending to them, she was doing it with the utmost care and compassion. It was obvious that she cared about them. Now that just stunned Fachita. It would probably stun you. It would probably stun me. But Fachita, at this point, the war had just ended, and Fachita had been one of the people responsible for going to 2 cities to check on the damage after the bombs. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. He saw people whose flesh had melted off due to the bomb. He saw people dying of radiation poisoning. The whole team that went with him to these cities, well, guess what happened? They all died of radiation poisoning. For some reason, he didn't. Never had a problem. He never had a problem, yet he was exposed to the same thing. Well, what he saw shook him to his soul, and he saw the actual human carnage that had been caused, and he just thought to himself, there can be no more Pearl Harbors, because Pearl Harbors lead to Hiroshimas, and Hiroshimas lead to Nagasaki's, and this is what I'm seeing. So at this point, Fachita was no longer the samurai warrior, if you will. He was running from that point of view. But he wasn't running to anything yet. He was just wondering if there was something out there that made sense. But his worldview was obviously shaken. Well, his worldview is shaken, and then he's got this guy telling him there's this woman that had missionary parents that were killed by us, and she treated us like we were angels. And Kanagasaki pointed out to Fachita that they had this prayer. And so Fachita's like, well, what did her father pray? He's wanting to know. He's trying to figure out what this is all about. Kanagasaki says, how would I know? What difference does that make? Fachita says, well, why pray to a God that can't save them? Because that was the obvious implication. Surely this God is supposed to be able to rescue you. I don't know, but I know this. The girl loved us like we were her own brothers, even better than brothers. Well, the thing that Fachita was referencing is it's a tradition of the samurai to uphold the honor of your family. It would be a revenge killing. Katakuchi would be the name. It was noble. It was right. It was justice. In that culture, it was what should have happened. Fujita is hearing nothing like that happen, and it made no sense to him. Well, his friend talking to Fujita shook him so much that he went to find other POWs. He was now kind of obsessed with this, who were served by this same woman, so they were all amputees. Every one of them confirmed the original story that he had heard from his friend. Fujita became convinced she has some kind of genuine love that has stopped the cycle of revenge, but he didn't know what it was. He didn't know where it came from. He just knew that you couldn't love like that on your own. There had to be something deeper. Well, a couple of years, his search leads him to a street corner in Tokyo where there's a man handing out pamphlets and yelling out over the crowd to read about the Doolittle Raider who was a prisoner of war. Fujita grabbed the leaflet and he got out of the crowd, and he had respect for that airman because they had risked their lives in their mission in the same way that his troops had risked their lives at Pearl Harbor. When he had a chance, he read the story of Jacob DeShazer. And he wondered if what had happened to Peggy had also happened to DeShazer, because he's telling a story of love and forgiveness as well. Now, the pamphlet mentioned that DeShazer had written a book by the same title. So Fujita bought the book. It took him about a week to read the whole story, and what DeShazer described seemed very strange to Fujita as well, but he realized that what he was saying sounded very much like what Kanagasaki was telling him about this woman out there in Utah. So reading about DeShazer, hearing about Covell, pushed Fujita towards, I'm just going to go buy a Bible. He wasn't interested in religion. He wasn't, like, at this point thinking God's the answer. He's just curious about what makes a person's mind go from the way I think they ought to think to the way they're thinking now. He knew that these recollections of his friends and the other POWs were very real. So he also knew then, when he read this, he knew that DeShazer's story was also true. That brings us to the third guy in this picture, Jake DeShazer. In the summer of 40, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps. He was assigned as a mechanic, and he upgraded to bombardier. He was pretty good at it. On December 7, 1941, everybody knows that date. That was the day of Pearl Harbor. He's peeling potatoes, and he's listening to the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers football game. I didn't know that there was a Brooklyn Dodgers football team. There actually was back in the day. This is when Jake, the radio breaks in that there's been an attack. Jake's filled with hatred. These are his words. Those Jap bastards are going to pay for this. No one does this to the USA and gets away with it. No one. You can hear the hate. You can hear the disgust. In February of 42, a couple of years after that, he's at an Army base in South Carolina. About 18 months later. He's now a bombardier. When he got the word to report to a meeting, figuring I've done something wrong, I screwed up. So he walks into a room, and there's a group of people standing around there, and there's this man in the middle, kind of an intense guy. His name was Captain James Doolittle. He didn't remember much of what Doolittle said when he introduced himself, but he did say this: some of you fellows are going to get killed. Well, Jake's thinking, I'm not volunteering for something where some of us fellows are going to get killed. So he's waiting for the first guy to dodge, and when the first guy to dodge is, he's going to speak up and go, I'm with him. Well, there's 25 in the room, there's 24 yeses. Doolittle shows up in front of him and he says, and will you go, soldier? Yes, sir. You can count on me, sir. And just like that, Jake became a Doolittle Raider. The plan was very simple. All you had to do was take 16 medium-sized bombers, launch them from an aircraft carrier that had never been done before, 450 miles away from the Japanese coast, fly at 100 feet the entire way to avoid radar detection, bomb the targeted cities. You don't have enough gas to get back to the carrier, but you do have enough gas to fly to Free China, where you will land, be met with a hero's welcome, and ultimately returned to America. The best laid plans of mice and men often fail. 700 miles out from the coast of Japan, they were spotted by a trawler. The trawler was actually a intel. Cruiser blew it out of the water, but not before it had a chance to send the message there are American carriers in the area. This meant that they had to take off 250 miles before they were supposed to. It gets worse. They actually were. They were the last plane on the ship to leave. All these planes are strapped down. While they're strapping these planes down, Jake finds out as he's about to board his bomber that the tail of the other plane had busted the plexiglass face of his bomber. He now has a hole in his plexiglass big enough to run your leg through. Now, if you've ever flown in an airplane, you know that drag is not a good thing. And here he is sitting here looking at this going, this is our ticket out of here. All I got to do is say we can't fly. He gets in, he climbs in, they all strap in, he doesn't say anything. When it's just about time to take off, he tells the pilot, he says, boss, we got a problem down here. What do you want to do? He sends the co-pilot down. The co-pilot tries to jam a jacket in it. It doesn't work. The bottom line is Jake DeShazer flies at 100 feet off the ocean floor with this thing blowing in his face at 220 knots. That's how they went in. Obviously, they were supposed to go in as a group. What happens to his plane? It lags back because it can't go as fast because it's got extra drag. They're now flying solo. This means they will be the last plane to enter the Japanese coastline. They will obviously have people knowing that they're coming. Well, they did manage to make it into Japan. They were bombing not Tokyo, but Nagoya, probably about 40, 50 miles away. They hit a fuel factory, and then they also hit an airplane construction area. They turned to China. They're already 250 miles short, and they're already losing fuel because of the extra drag. They're in horrible weather. They have no idea where the rendezvous point is to land, and they can't go below the clouds because if they do, there's a good chance they're going to kiss a mountain. So they're just flying. They're flying in the direction they think they need to fly. 14 hours of fuel, 14 hours of flight, they're done. No flight, no fuel. They bail out. Jake hits the mud. Could have been worse. Could have been a house. Could have been a tree. They didn't know where they were. They had no idea. He's in the mud. It's horrible because it's raining. He found a small shrine where he spent the night. He had no idea where his buddies were. He could hear houses. He could hear soldiers. He could hear people. And he saw some people playing with children. So he says, American, Chinese, Japan. And they said, China. He said, good. They gave him some food. They fed him. They brought him to a command shack where he was met with 5 bayonets and the commander who says, welcome to the Empire of Japan. His answer, they always told me you all look alike. I should have known. Well, for Jake, the war was over. But the hell, the living hell, was beginning. Deprived of food, deprived of sleep, continuous interrogations, continuous beatings, and his home was a wooden cage, 6 foot by 5 foot with a 12-foot ceiling. So he was living in 30 square feet. Jake was transferred to Tokyo eventually because what they wanted to do, first of all, was parade Doolittle's raiders through the street to humiliate them and to give the people in Japan a sense of we're still in control. Then he was brought to Shanghai. There they had a trial where the men were determined to be war criminals and all were sentenced to death. They signed some papers. They didn't know what they signed, but what they actually had signed was that these were the things that they had supposedly done. The only problem was that all of this was stated in Japanese and no one told them what was actually being said. Well, they were all sentenced to die, but the emperor told the commander, let's show as an act of mercy, we'll only kill 3. The others after this would remain in solitary confinement. They're 6 by 5 by 12 cells, pending the ultimate development of the war. 3 men were selected, and they were given 1 night to bake their peace. The next day, all of them were drug out into the yard. The commander was not really enthusiastic. In fact, he was very unenthusiastic about this, but he had to do his duty. He's trying to think of what he could say, and he says this. He says, Christ died on a cross, and you on your part will die on a cross as well. But when you are executed, when you die on your cross, you will be honored as gods. He obviously didn't know anything about Christianity, but he was trying to connect the best way he could with people that he really didn't have much of a beef with. The commander hoped that he was giving them an honorable death according to their beliefs. They took them in. They tied them up to 3 crosses with their arms behind them, on their knees, and they shot them. Jake witnesses all this. He's now a prisoner in solitary. Jake discovered that in his 6x5, it was skinny enough that he could actually shimmy up the wall to be able to look at the top of the roof. He could actually see outside. It was the outside world. It was the only time this would allow him to know there's still a world out there. So he would do this. That's how he passed his days. Little to no food. Every once in a while you get outside. This is what happened, and these were the kind of events that happened. While they were outside, one of the prisoners talked to another one. This was the only time they saw somebody that they could talk to for maybe 30 minutes a day, except for the guard, who generally they needed to learn Japanese because the guard didn't know English. The guard came up to the prisoner and slapped him in the face because he was talking to another prisoner. The prisoner that he slapped calmly put his mop down, calmly put his pail on the ground, and then slapped the guard as hard as he could. The guard pulls his sword out and tries to run him through, but the prisoner was pretty nimble. One of the other guards gets involved, grabs a sword, and cuts himself. It turns into absolute, total melee, chaos. And then it ended just as quickly as it began. But there were 2 things that they knew here. First of all, the guards were totally unpredictable. You didn't necessarily know what they were going to do at all. And the second thing is, men can be pushed to the point where death is no longer the worst option. If they were going to kill him, they were going to kill him, but he just wasn't going to take it anymore. Well, it became obvious after a while that there was political expedience in keeping these guys alive. So they got a little bit more food, and they got a little bit better treatment. And this is 2 years after the raid. Jake was now number 5. He had always been number 5. They didn't have a name. He would take as much time as he could when he was tasked with mopping, because anything was better than sitting in a 6x5 cell with no light by yourself, and the stench and the filth and all the things that go with it. His guard tells him to hurry up. Jake, using his best Japanese, tells him, "Keep your shirt on, jackass." Apparently, Jake's Japanese was getting better, because the guard unlocked the door, and that meant that there was now coming a whooping, a beating. The guard punched Jake on the side of his head. Jake kicks the guard with his bare feet. The guard starts beating Jake with the hilt of his sword. In desperation, Jake grabs the mop and put in the pail, and he throws a whole mess at the guard and hits him in the face. The guard storms out. This was the guard that Jake hated the most. Now, because of this mercy from the emperor, they now got a book to read every once in a while. This is about 2 weeks later. "Book!" shouted the guard. Jake slides David Copperfield under the door, and the guard shoves another book to him. It was a Bible. A worn, dog-eared Bible. Keep 3 weeks. Jake never had much use for religion. About the only thing he remembered from Sunday school was he had a Sunday school teacher one time tell him he punched a hole in his muffler to make it louder. That sounds like some of the things that you people would remember, right? But he did know that he knew his mom was a believer, and he knew his mother considered the book to be important and a source of strength. And so what does he have to do? So as long as there's light, he reads. He reads because he has time. It took 2 weeks to read the Bible cover to cover twice, because he's got time on his hands. In particular, he started to be fascinated by the prophets and their ability to know what would happen long before it actually did. So he just decides, "You still talk to people, God?" I asked, "Do you still talk to people, God?" I didn't think so. But Jake still perseveres. He starts shuffling back and forth between the prophecies and the Gospels. Born in Bethlehem, check. Betrayed by friends, check. Pierced in hands and feet, check. Given vinegar to drink, check. A lot of other things related to that, check, check, and check. How do you know all that ahead of time, he asked. He's starting to wonder himself. Then he focused on the story of Jesus being nailed to a cross. Jake thought to himself, I would have said the same thing the crowd did. If you really are God, save yourself. Seemed reasonable. But he went back to Isaiah and he read 53, where he's a man of sorrows, rejected, despised. But this time he noticed the rest of the story, our griefs he himself bore, our sorrows he carried. He was wounded for our transgressions. Well, it's time to fish or cut bait. He knew what he was reading. He knew that the stories were genuine. And so he also knew that he genuinely hated the Japanese. But just like Fujita now, he was being forced to consider that love was more powerful than hate. If this God is real, then I got to listen to him. And so he said, well, I'll try. I'll see what happens if I do what God wants me to do. But he had one final request. He said, God, all right, I'll do it. Just don't let me be one of those damn hypocrites, because I hate those guys. Now, when I was helping Mike DeMaria we had some youth ministry going on over what used to be New Covenant, which was, they had a youth building right there by the train tracks. And the pastor of the church, who was let me just say, he was a button-down Baptist pastor. He was a great guy. He's a great guy. And he's standing there. And one kid is telling the rest of the group his testimony. He said, you know, before Mr. Wade talked to me, I used to be a horny little bastard. And I look over at the pastor, and the look on his face was priceless, because you could not wipe the grin off of his face. All the kid was doing was talking from where he was and where he was going, and he just ain't got all the way there yet. And he was using the only words he knew to use, and we get so focused on what people say instead of what's happening that we lose that sometime. God bless the pastor, because he had the wherewithal. In fact, he laughed out loud, not just sort of. He let one rip. This is kind of the same thing. All right, God, just don't make me one of those hypocrites, right? He's just saying what you would expect for someone who's at this crossroads, stuck in a 6x5 cell, getting beat by people for no reason. And he says, okay, I'll try this stuff. It's now the fall of 44. Jake is a prisoner for almost 3 years, a little longer. Jake's being shoved from behind as he's walking to a cell. The guard whacks Jake with his sword, the hilt of it, and Jake stumbles from the pain. The guard slams the door on Jake's heel. They don't have shoes. Jake tries to pull his foot in, but the guard just keeps pushing harder. Jake hammers the door with his shoulder, and that gave him enough time to scrape his now torn up foot from the door. The guard bolted the door with an extra loud clank. Jake's head hurts. Jake's foot's bleeding. Everything's throbbing. This was the guard Jake hated. He was surrounded by hate. And then he remembered, love your enemy and do good to those who hate you. Half mad, insane, he described himself. Jake peered out of the slit in his cell, because he had a little spot about so big where he could communicate with the guards. I'll be damned if I'm gonna. But he didn't finish the sentence, because he was now being surrounded by God instead of hate. The next morning, when the guard made his rounds, Jake waits until the guard nears his cell. Ohayo gozaimasu. Good morning. The guard stopped momentarily, said nothing, and kept going. The next morning, how are you today? The sixth day. Good day, sir. This time, the guard looks at Jake, stops, but keeps moving. That afternoon, Jake heard something slide under the door. When he looked up, it was the guard that he hated, staring at him, but with no emotion. He brought him a sweet potato, a cooked sweet potato, and he gave it to Jake. A few days later, the guard stands near Jake's door. Jake, you have brothers? Guard, 2. Sisters? 1. She's oldest. Jake, I have 3 sisters. One's a half-sister. My father died when I was 2 and Mom remarried. Gord, brothers? 1, but I am number 1 son. Gord, so am I. And there was a slight sign of a smile. And after 2 years, Jake says this, my name is Jake, not number 5. What is your name? Aota Takechi. Aota? Yes. He's looking around the guard terrified because he's afraid that someone's going to say he's fraternizing with the enemy. So he says, I've got to go, Jake. Conversations progress. Aota tells Jake about the death of his mother when he was a little boy. He tells Jake how he prayed to his mother. So the ice is breaking. One day in the spring of 1945, all the prisoners are taken and placed in leg irons. Jake knew this routine. It meant they were about to get on a train and go. Aota and Jake speak. Good luck, Jake. Jake knew how long it must have taken Aota to practice so he could pronounce correctly luck, because L is not in the Japanese linguist. It's not in their language. There is no L sound. So L would come out as R. But Aota went to great pains to say luck. Jake knew that. And he knew that what had happened there, that there had been a lot of practice. Jake returns the favor. Take care of yourself, partner. Neither man was prepared for the lump in their throats. Aota places his green hood over the top of his head, and as Jake looks out, because it has 2 eye holes, he sees Aota wipe a tear. The train ride was nothing short of hell, living hell. The guards decided we don't want to have to worry about these guys taking bathroom breaks, so they just won't give them any water. While he's sitting there, he sees officers slapping subordinates for trifling offenses. He sees an officer slap an elderly Chinese woman to the ground because she didn't move her bags quickly enough. And all the time, verses are coming back to Jake. Treat others the way you want to be treated. He who is least among you is the one who is the greatest. And the greatest of these is love. These things are starting to go through his mind. And there's one tiny village where they're traveling. He gets on this mother gets on with 2 kids. 2 kids had never seen an American prisoner. What do 2 kids do when they've never seen something? They go check it out. So they're cautiously approaching Jake, and he's being watched carefully by the guards. They get close to Jake, and they're kind of looking at him, and he's got this little green hood on, and he's looking at them. Boom! Then they take off running. They're going back to their mom screaming. The mom's laughing. The guards are laughing. And Jake's thinking to himself, people are just the same everywhere. Well, he's at his new prison now. No more guard that he befriended. He's let out once a week to bathe. He could constantly hear beatings, and he had developed boils, bad boils. He was blacking out and collapsing, drifting in and out of consciousness. He knew these were the things that happened before you died. Jake cried out to God, and according to Jake, God answered. They started paying a little bit more attention to him, gave him some vitamins and more regular round of meals. His health restored a little bit. And then there was the bomb. My guess is that they knew that this could very well be, in reality, this is certainly God intervening. But the Japanese probably knew we don't need a bunch of soldiers sitting around here looking like they have been starved to death. We need to treat them better. Because if they are found, we don't want to be responsible for that. Well, the bomb. After the bomb, that was the war, right? The Japanese surrendered fairly quickly. Well, now we've got to get our prisoners out. And so this team of American volunteers is inserted into Japan, knowing that the risk could be very high. And one of the places that they were going was where they knew Doolittle's raiders were being held. There were some intense negotiations between the Americans and the Japanese commander of the camp. The Americans wondering if they were going to be killed. This went on for a couple of days, and the Americans had this big burly 6'2", 6'3", and the Japanese were about 5 foot, 5'1". That was not unintentional. This whole notion of we're here to intimidate was part of the deal. You're going to give us our people back. On August the 20th, 1945, there had been nearly 4 years of isolated captivity. Jake's cell was open. He looks up. Here's this big American major. Here's the general running the prison. There's a guard. The guard bowed to Jake. Do you think that had ever happened? And told him, war over, go home. Well, Jake went to a hero's welcome. First few weeks home, he spoke with his mother alone, and he told her something amazing. He said, I think I got to go back to Japan. I might be a janitor at a church or something, but I'm going to go back to college. I'm going to learn Japanese, and I'm going to go back to Japan. He said, to think about all those years, me and the boys just wanted to get back home. Now all I can do is think about getting back to Japan. And his mother told him, son, I'm with you all the way, because she could tell that he had changed. He went to Pacific College, put him on a fast track for a degree, had a Japanese professor that helped him write I Was a Prisoner of Japan, and the college president helped him write I Was a Prisoner of Japan. So the book was he had assistance with the book by two people that were there at the college. He also found his wife and married her, Florence. She had never been out of country. Now she's going to Japan along with their 1-year-old son. Well, what Jake didn't know was over 1 million copies of the book had been distributed all across Japan. The country people, the people in Japan were very aware of it. They all wanted to meet this man who loved his enemies and had ultimately became their friend. Didn't our guards spit on you and beat you? Why would you return to our country? And Jake said, this would be the typical answer, I don't have any bitterness towards the people who mistreated us. They didn't know any better way to live. At first I thought God would help me love good people, but wouldn't expect me to love the mean ones. But that didn't sound very right. So I remembered that Jesus said to love your enemies and to do good to those who mistreat you. God was patient with me. He forgave me. So I'm just doing the same thing for others. Well, for 3 months, Jake spoke just about everywhere he could. Churches, schools, Buddhist centers, department stores. It didn't matter. He was wondering if he was making a difference. Have you ever wondered if you're making a difference? And then he got this letter. It had to be translated from Japanese, but his wife had made sure that it was done. Thank you very much for coming to our town. While you were talking, I cried very much. The Japanese were cruel in their treatment of you, and I saw you had a great deal of hatred for them. They were ignorant and unreasonable in the way they treated you. I have no words to apologize. Please forgive us. But you have already forgiven us, and you came to Japan to help us. I could not keep my tears from falling when I saw the love that God had put into your heart. I've been a very evil girl. I've told many lies, but now I am sorry. I have been working at a factory to support my 3 brothers and my parents who were sick. I was discouraged. I tried to kill myself 3 times. But I couldn't go through with it. I did not care about myself or my country, and I was becoming sick. I always hated God, but through you, I was born as a child in the heavenly kingdom. Now the Lord is my light and my shield, and I'm not afraid anymore. I'm full of hope for the future, and I've even started taking classes at the university. Thank you very much for what you have done. I hope that I can hear you again. Please give my kindest regards to Mrs. DeShazer. May God bless you. Sometimes in our worst moments is when God taps you on the shoulder and goes, I'm still here. And that was probably one for him. At one meeting, a lady came to assassinate Jake. Her husband had been killed at the Battle of Midway. During the Doolittle raids. During the Doolittle raids, her husband had been killed at one of the factories that they had bombed. She found out this guy was coming, and the honorable thing to do was to kill him. Her husband had been killed. She went to the event. She had a concealed knife. She found where she could sit. She waited for a moment. Then she heard this. Jake said, when I made up my mind not to shoot at civilians from my plane, I was so angry I did it anyway. I knew right from wrong. I just didn't have the power to make right choices. I knew there had to be more to life than hatred and revenge and killing. They passed around books for us to read in prison. One day a guard gave me a Bible. I read and read, looked for some answers. I read about another man who was insulted and tortured and no one cared. People thought he was getting what he deserved. They did not know who he really was. But it turned out he chose to be tortured and killed so we could be free from the power of hatred. I wanted that too. I knew I needed that. It wasn't the evil around me I needed to be rescued from. It was the evil inside me. What a statement from a guy who was locked up in a cell. In that dark jail cell, I was set free from the prison of hatred and a deep love for the Japanese people and chose to live here with my family. I came in the name of peace and in the name of love. The lady who came to kill Jake became a follower of Christ and ultimately befriended Jake. 2 years later, we'll get to the end of this. 2 years later, Jake and his family were eating at a restaurant. They're eating with some Japanese friends. He said, man, this isn't very good. What is it? His friend said, well, the squid guts. Well, that's probably why I don't like it. While he's having that laugh, a stranger approached. Jake recognized him, the man who had tortured and beat him, the man who Jake had most out of the way, to his wife and to his friends. Florence, this is an old friend. We need to go speak in private. Jake goes to talk to him where Aota tells him that he had been reading. Jake told him the past was forgotten and offered to buy him a sweet potato. The same meal was complete. In 1950, Jake had just finished a 40-day fast. He was trying to be prepared to do as much as he could for the Japanese people. He broke the fast, he's eating breakfast, and someone knocks at the door. Jake welcomes him in and closes the door and tells him, and you put a smile on the face of my friend. So now the circle is complete. Because in that same Covell never met any of these people. She never met Fachita. She's in Massachusetts, and a friend comes up and gives her the local newspaper. She says, hey, there's a report here about the fellow who attacked Pearl Harbor. Says he's sorry now. He heard about some girl who lost her parents and family to the Japanese. Anyway, it's a great story. You need to read it. She didn't know that she had lived it. Peggy never let on. She went until she came to a private place where she read the story, and then she threw it in the light, and where there is sadness, joy. Thank you, dear Lord, for making this happen. Only you could have done this. And so, these are the kinds of stories that we should never have of our home. Our redemption that is available for anyone. It is also such a powerful message that no matter our circumstances, we talk about how bad our lives are. Has anyone in here been in solitary confinement in a 5x6 cell for 3 years where you hated the people that were dealing? No. But yet God reached into every one of these hearts and changed them in such a way that Aota, there's a picture in the book, Wounded Tiger, where they're all sitting together at Jake's house with both of their families eating dinner. Lifelong friends. DeShazer and Fachita. DeShazer's reason he's in prison is because Fachita had bombed Pearl Harbor and America was going to retaliate. Lifelong friends. Whatever the barriers are in our lives, we have to be careful. Because if we read Matthew 5 and we pay attention to it, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you to love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so you can be children of your Father in heaven. Causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Even the tax collectors and the pagans do that. So he's telling us that there's a power that's at work in us that isn't at work in the world. That power is what made Fachita realize his friend had been treated in a way that simply should not have happened if everyone followed the normal code of behavior. So too with DeShazer. There's no way he should have cared about his guards. There's certainly no reason why he should have felt compelled to go back to Japan. And then there's no reason why a lady would be so kind and loving to the very people who had tortured and beheaded her family. Well, there is a reason. And the question becomes, we hear these stories and we go, wow, that's pretty powerful. And then we forget the same God that wrote these stories is writing on our heart. This is the same God with the same opportunities. We may not face these struggles, and we can thank God if we don't. But if we do, we can also realize that when Jesus was writing Matthew 5, he was talking to us, he was also talking to himself, because he did love his enemy. He did pray for those who persecuted him. Ultimately, in a manner that was the most sacrificial of all. So the story is an incredible one. If you want to read it, the book is Wounded Tiger. DeShazer also has an autobiography. Fuchida also has an autobiography. Both of them wrote about their experiences. It's amazing stuff. And what happened then can and still does happen today. So as we head out into the world, may we be filled with the same love and the same spirit that these folks were. Father, we ask that your story not just be one where we go, oh boy, that sounds good, because Hollywood couldn't make this story up. The changes that you can create go beyond fairy tales. And in the midst of all this horror, in the midst of the war, in the midst of all the things that man was doing, you showed up and people responded. May we respond as you are here today. It's in your Son's name we pray, and everyone said, Amen.